Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of whether, and if so, how, politics should appear in our preaching this week. My name's Jenny Mills, and I'm the Secretary for Education and Learning in the United Reformed Church, and I'm loving being the host of these podcasts and meeting such amazing people who are sharing with me their thinking around the issues in the world and the texts that we encounter through the lectionary. Each week, I'm joined by a guest from a different place and space on the pulpit and political landscape. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Cameron Hume. Cameron is Resource Writing and Editing Officer for All We Can. All We Can is an international development and relief organisation working to see every person's potential fulfilled. It's focused on serving the world's most marginalised communities and is rooted in the Christian faith. All We Can helps find solutions to poverty by engaging with local people and organisations in some of the world's poorest communities to end the suffering caused by inequality and injustice through partnership and advocacy. Cameron is also a Methodist local preacher. He is a former JPIT intern where he spent half of his time working in the House of Lords. And Cameron lives in Newcastle, of which he's very proud. So it's with great delight that I welcome Cameron to be with us this morning.
Hello.
Hi, Cameron. Lovely to see you. Well, welcome from Newcastle. So thanks for joining us today. So politics in the pulpit. I wonder what that means from you. I can see from your bio that you would clearly see the links between politics and faith and believe in reaching those who are marginalised. But tell us a little bit about yourself and how you see those two things connect.
Yeah, I think for me, they've always been connected. I'm quite lucky. Both my parents are Methodist ministers, and throughout my childhood, whenever I saw them preach and talk, they were the kind of preachers who would link faith and politics and faith and justice. So I think I took it as a given, I guess, which was great. But then I'd say when I got to university maybe and came across other Christians who maybe weren't so passionate about justice and didn't take it as a given that the Bible calls us to interact with the political sphere and to reach out to the most marginalized and really care about those who have been forgotten about. I think that reinforced that for me. It didn't challenge my assumptions, but actually made them stronger in kind of opposition to other worldviews that I came across, and made me more passionate about it. And that kind of led me onto the JPIT internship, which only further reinforced that, and meeting so many other Christians who are passionate about similar things and really working it out in practice in effective ways really helped me to solidify my ideas and my practice as well, I'd say. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And now you work with All You Can. What do you see as the most pressing justice issues? And share with us what you'd like to hear, particularly as we come into Refugee Week.
Yeah, so we've been working at All We Can for a few months now. And I guess that's giving a more global lens to my preaching. I think before I had a very kind of UK-centered approach to when I was preaching about politics. I think it's very easy to get drawn into the daily churn of political news. I think even though I'm not quite as obsessed politically as I was a few years ago, it's so easy to only have a UK-centered approach to thinking about politics. So I think that's one thing that's changing already. I think at All We Can, we're very passionate about decolonized development and anti-racist development. And so the way we approach our work with our partners in some of the poorest communities, the way we do that, we think has to be part of the solution. And that intersects with other conversations around anti-racism and decolonization. So we put communities in the driving seat. We don't come in presuming that we have all the answers, trying to impose a Western frame on things. We think that local communities are in the best place to analyse their own situation. They're the experts in their position. So our job is to come in and not giving answers, but asking the right questions and coming alongside them as partners, as equal partners, rather than imposing something. And we think that is the best way to do development in a way that isn't reinforcing these kind of historical power dynamics that have affected development in the past and sadly still goes on in many other aspects of development. But we're particularly looking this week at Refugee Week. So this Sunday is Refugee Week Sunday, and we've produced a raft of resources for churches, which includes a service outline and a sermon outline, which I've put together, which links these lectionary passages this week with issues of refugees, which is why I'm here, I think.
Excellent. That is absolutely perfect timing. And can you let us know how people can access that?
Yeah, so just on the All We Can website, I think it'll be the first banner that comes up when you go on the website that will take you to those resources that you can download and print out fairly easily.
Lovely. Thank you ever so much. Well, each week I ask my JPIT colleagues for a little roundup of their expertise and what they think we should be keeping an eye on. And as you say, it's Refugee Week 2022. People can go to All You Can, and also JPIT are sharing resources. There is a website, refugeeweek.org.uk. The theme of this year's Refugee Week is healing. And this comes in the wake of the proposal for electronic tagging of refugees who are told that they may be deported to Rwanda, and comes in the light of an increasing support for refugees, which has been raised by the issues both in Ukraine and other parts of the world. We also have the rail strikes going on this week, highlighting cost of living, workers' rights, and the long-term effects of COVID on communities, but also the necessity for negotiation and conversation. We have the Northern Ireland deal, the ongoing deadlock around the Northern Ireland Protocol, raising hostility in Ireland, UK, and the EU. And we have the by-elections in Wakefield and Tiverton and Honiton, triggered by the resign of incumbent Conservative MPs, one for watching porn in the House of Commons and the other for sexual assault. I'd also add that in the church season, we're in the second Sunday after Trinity, or we're in ordinary time. But through Trinity, we are reminded of God in community and relationship. And this week on the 24th, we have the commemoration of the birth of John the Baptist. So at a time when the Church of England is under particular fire, as are other faith leaders, for getting involved in politics, which does make me chuckle slightly, we have our newspapers in one hand and our Bibles in the other. And Cameron, over to you. I wonder where you would like us to begin on the lectionary readings, and I look forward to you leading us through the texts. So over to you.
Sure. Well, in our Refugee Week resources from All We Can, we're focusing on the Luke 9 passage and also Psalm 16, which is the alternate psalm that's suggested. There's usually two psalms, and that's the second one. So I guess I can start with them, but I can certainly bring in the other lectionary passages to talk not just about refugees, but also their wider implications for justice and politics. So with the Luke 9 passage, I think what immediately struck me, so this is where Jesus says, foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. That when we think about refugees, I think the passage we immediately go to is Jesus being a refugee in the nativity story. And that's kind of our go-to passage for whenever we talk about how Christianity intersects with how we think about refugees. And I think this offers a really good reminder that Jesus wasn't just a refugee as a child, but he was also homeless as a man. He was totally reliant on the kindness of strangers and the support of his friends to keep him going. And when he was visiting different villages, he needed people to take him in. And because of that, he's not unsympathetic with the kind of rejection and hostility that many refugees today face. And as we see in this passage, he goes to it's a Samaritan village, isn't it?
Yes.
And he's rejected.
Yeah.
Because his face was sent towards Jerusalem. And just that kind of, particularly with what we're seeing in the last few weeks around the flights to Rwanda and stuff, that hostility and immediate distrust is something that Jesus faced as well, which makes this an easy passage. It's just kind of very apt that this is a lectionary on the same week as Refugee Week. It makes it a very easy in to talking about hostility and distrust.
And the sense of the other in our lives. And I think I really appreciated your comment about focusing on sort of UK politics, and actually, there's so much more in the world, but the sense of the other is huge at the moment, and quite a lot of negative rhetoric around kind of demonizing the other, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of borne out in the polling, which is sometimes the thing that I find most depressing. I think when you hear politicians talking about the other and kind of this kind of stigmatizing, you can think that that's just confined to Westminster, but then sometimes you look at the polls and it's like, wow, like the percentage of people who are on board with this is really disappointing and distressing, certainly.
And yet Jesus, sorry, yeah, go on.
I was just going to move on to the other thing that we're talking about from this Luke 9 passage in our resources is how Jesus calls us for the long haul in our justice work and our political work. So different people come up to him and say, I want to follow you. And each time he offers them a challenge, which is effectively saying, like, are you really in this, though? Are you really committed? And I think that's sometimes something we need to ask ourselves. We can easily set up an initiative and then not be in it for the long haul and let that initial enthusiasm wane quite quickly. And I think Jesus offers us that challenge that if we're going to serve people, if we're going to start up new initiatives, we need to be properly committed and in it for the long haul, which is something that, as all we can, we're very committed to in our work with refugees overseas. So we commit to very long-term partnerships up to 15 years rather than coming in, dropping off some supplies and then immediately withdrawing. We know that to create sustainable change and to really make a difference in people's lives, that has to be a long-term journeying in order to make that sustainable.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think what I was going to say was this whole idea of Jesus' nonviolent protest, a nonviolent response to things, when he turns and he rebukes the disciples, doesn't he? How did you hear that particular bit in verse 55?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that's maybe hard for us to hear because sometimes I feel like the disciples, and I'm the one who wants to send down fire on my enemies or the people who are, in my view, committing atrocities and enacting policies that are absolutely horrible. I want to be that person who's like, oh, just strike them down, God, come on. But it's maybe a gentle reminder that to not become worse than the people that we disagree with, that, it would be not an appropriate response that the Samaritans are rejecting Jesus to then strike them down with fire. It's not very proportionate. So I think that's something we need to hear in our politics, thinking about how we disagree well, that's not something we resort to kind of in our disagreement. I
think sometimes when you look at the world of politics, it is kind of draining, isn't it? It is quite depressing at times, and you do kind of want to hit out or to stoop to the same level sometimes, and it is that sense of how you keep that perspective. And Jesus was refused. He was refused hospitality. He was rejected, and yet he responded with grace. And that's one that he doesn't judge them, does he? He moves on. He continues on, and kind of with his eyes to something better. He knows that even though it's going to be hard, what comes next, but actually there is something better ahead.
Yeah, I think something that I've maybe shifted my perspective on is kind of anger in politics.
Yeah.
I think we can very easily jump towards Jesus flipping over tables, which of course he did. And anger and righteous anger is absolutely something that we can hold on to at times. But I mean, it's maybe also apt that we've got the fruits of the Spirit passage from Galatians 5 as the lectionary this week as well. And anger is not a fruit of the Spirit. It's something we occasionally need, but gentleness is a fruit of the Spirit. And I think I would sometimes want angry Jesus as my default Jesus, but anger isn't the default and anger isn't the end goal. Gentleness is the fruit of the Spirit. and that's something that really challenges me when I want to just be angry and just shouting from the sidelines. But how can I actually be enacting gentleness in the way I go about justice in politics is really hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And this the three examples of kind of how hard discipleship is are quite fascinating and kind of their time, really, aren't they? As so much that Jesus does, he kind of goes to an extreme to make his point. But they are words that everybody, people would have ploughed in a way that we don't plough. But that idea of keeping your furrow straight, rather than, if you take your eyes off the direction you're going, that's when you become distracted.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing that kind of speaks to at the end of that Luke 9 passage is our capability of putting things off as well. That kind of all of them say, "Oh, we'll follow you, but first let me do this. I'll follow you, but first let me do this." And I think that can be said for how, as a church, we sometimes go about our justice work. I was listening to our district evangelism enabler the other week, because I think it works for evangelism as well, saying that the ideal size for a church plant, according to churches, is always a little bit bigger than we are now. Or that kind of, we'll be in a position to church plant when we're just a little bit bigger than we are now. And I think that's maybe sometimes the case for setting up justice initiatives and starting political advocacy as a church as well. It's often, we want to be able to do that, but we're not quite ready yet. We don't quite have enough people or quite have enough capacity to be able to do something effective. But we're always going to be able to put those things off. And I think that's another challenge that Jesus gives here, is that, if you're ideologically committed to doing it, then crack on with it. Always be able to put it off.
Yes, no, that's a really helpful exhortation. Is there anything else you want to offer us through this Luke passage, or do you want to move on to the Psalm?
I think I'm happy to move on. That sounds good. Psalm 16, which is also one of the lectionary ones this week, starts with, "Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge," which is also very apt for this week, but also just a reminder that as well as Jesus being in solidarity with displaced people and with refugees, the whole Israelite community was very well acquainted with displacement and seeking refuge. That's intrinsic to who the Israelites were. After coming out of Egypt and wandering, and then the Babylonian exile, that displacement is key to who the Israelites are and to their identity. And so through reading these Psalms, we can read them with our mindset maybe having not experienced displacement, but when you see them in that original context, you see those themes just kind of flying out. And there was another part later on in the Psalm that I was going to bring people's attention to, which I can't remember now. Something about borders is in there. I think it says, "Oh, thank you that the borders have landed for me in great places." I forget the original wording. I can't find it.
Verse 6, I think the version I've got is, "The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places."
There we go. And that kind of humility, that when we are in a position of not having to seek refuge, thanking God for the boundary lines falling for us in pleasant places, that's not something we cling on to and try to prevent other people from gaining. It's something kind of we hold lightly and in humility, knowing that that could happen to us, that it can happen to anyone, and that naturally coming from that should be the desire to extend hospitality to others and to welcome others into having pleasant brown boundary lines, not trying to deny that to other people. So I think there's a certain humility that comes out of that psalm for those of us who aren't in positions of displacement. That's good to be reminded of.
I was looking last week about in worship about being named, and being named is so important, being named and known, but actually place, knowing where you come from, knowing what matters in your kind of geography of your life is so important, isn't it? And I hear that sense of we often take so much for granted because we haven't experienced that that fragility of belonging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the Ukraine crisis is maybe something that reminds us of that particularly, that it really could happen to anyone. I mean, I think we need to be mindful of not slipping into slightly racist language there, because if we say that about Ukraine but don't say that about Yemen and all these other places where people are fleeing, then we can be slightly hypocritical. But I think it is a reminder of a country with a slightly higher GDP that seemed very stable, then falling into a place where there is lots of displacement and lots of refugees, that it really could happen to anyone. And therefore, why would we not want to welcome and provide hospitality to those it is happening to? Because it's not through any virtue of our own that it's not us. It's in that position.
And when I was hearing about some of the visa applications, people were supposed to bring kind of deeds of their homes and stuff with them, and this idea that living in a vulnerable place, you have a bag with your key documents in that you could flee with. It's absolutely heartbreaking stuff that we just kind of, unless we hear those things, we would never imagine that vulnerability, would we?
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of the burden of proof being on the people seeking refuge to prove that they're in need is also maybe problematic as well, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned earlier that kind of the bishops who are under fire at the moment for speaking out against the Rwanda plan, and something I was thinking about this morning just before we started was how issues around refugees are something we can be even bolder as Christians about talking about. And I think that's being borne out in the way that the archbishops have spoken out against the Rwanda deportations, that on many issues you maybe have to be quite cautious about being explicit in what policies you would rather not have enacted or would rather have enacted. But I think because God's partiality towards refugees is a thread that's so intrinsically woven throughout Scripture, both throughout the whole Israelite community, Jesus being a refugee, Jesus being reliant on the kindness of strangers throughout his ministry, that it's so easy to be more emboldened and be explicit about that. I think there's lots of political issues where you've got to be like, well, I'm 80% sure this is what the Bible would call me to do. But I think around refugees and having kind of an unrestricted welcome, I think that's something that jumps out from the Bible so clearly that even the archbishops feel emboldened to be quite specific about what they disagree with the government on, which is maybe something worth reflecting on as a church, that this is an issue that we can be more explicit about.
Yeah, it's really helpful. Yeah, and so timely, as you say, with so much going on in relation to refugees, with the Refugee Week, it's a perfect time for us to be able to speak out and to be heard, isn't it? And that whole Galatians 5, that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That is there are so many examples, aren't there, in the Bible of the clear message of love for neighbor, love for other, which I saw something the other day on Twitter actually that said, if I agree with some of the policies that the government are doing, should I not be a Christian? And it's quite a wrestle, I imagine. If you are struggling with appreciating some of the policies, to come back and find the grounding of your faith, which is love, isn't it? It's just the essence of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I saw someone tweet the other day that classic phrase that God comforts the disturbed and disturbs the comfortable.
Yeah.
That even, if you find yourself in these kind of positions of wrestling with what you believe and how your politics intersects, that that welcome to people in our churches is open to everyone. But welcoming people in our churches isn't saying you're not going to be disturbed, you're not going to be made uncomfortable. We have to be made uncomfortable in church sometimes, and that's something that Conservative MPs have to respect and accept, as much as they'd rather it not be so sometimes.
And I think sometimes people in churches, we also struggle, don't we? Because we do become relatively comfortable, and we do focus on the immediate, our churches, and particularly at a time of decline of established religion. There is this focus on keeping everything going, whereas this call to go beyond those walls and to go beyond ourselves is huge, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And yeah, if we try and please everyone, then we'll please no one. And if we try and please everyone, then we'll never say anything particularly distinct or particularly profound or particularly prophetic. That sometimes that message is going to upset some people. And I think that's what the prophets in the Old Testament teach us time and time again, isn't it? The people who are on the margins, who are speaking out against injustice, are almost always shot down by those in authority. But that's their task. That's what they're called to do.
It's that uncomfortable place, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so where do you want to take us next?
Happy to talk about the Galatians 5 a bit more as well.
Okay, lovely.
Just in terms of those fruits of the Spirit, I think we often think of those as quite individual virtues. I think that's always been my instinct. But as with so many things in the Bible, as soon as you realize that they're also a communal thing, they're about us as a community, church community, as well as us as individuals, you can read them slightly differently. So I think reading the fruits of the Spirit through a political lens, thinking, how is this law, how is this policy helping to promote gentleness, kindness, self-control, and all the rest of them, that's maybe quite a good litmus test for public policy, is how is this policy helping to promote the fruit of the Spirit, and thinking of those as communal virtues, not just as individual ones, is maybe a helpful test for our politics.
Yeah. And that sense that if when we live God's way, those things will become a part of who we are, rather than us having to strive to do those things. But when we connect with God, when we live the way that God wills humanity to live, those things result, don't they? And when we choose to separate ourselves from love and separate ourselves from God, then that's when the other stuff creeps in, isn't it? Yeah.
And I think I've heard someone say, I can't necessarily know the original Greek for this, but that it's those things together are the fruit, that together they form the singular fruit, rather than being lots of individual fruits of the Spirit. So as you're saying, how they kind of naturally spring out, they're a package deal. They're not kind of, you focus particularly on kindness and then the next week you focus on gentleness. It's that when you love God and you love your neighbor, those things kind of naturally spring out as a whole package, rather than as a kind of disjointed individuals.
And I love that, because it's that idea that as you say, you could be faithful, but actually if you don't live with joy I like that idea of this holistic sense of it all.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing that struck me from the Galatians passage is this idea of freedom, whether it's an end in itself or something that is a tool for service. So obviously at the start of the passage, it's for freedom Christ has set us free, which I think could easily be used to say that freedom is the end goal, that freedom is the ultimate thing that we seek. But then in verse 13, for you were called to freedom, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. And this idea that the freedom that we gain through Christ is something that we use to serve others, not something that we cling on to for its own sake. And I think kind of moving away from refugees for a second, but particularly with the gun laws kind of debates in the US at the moment, that's something that speaks into that sometimes freedom is this thing that people lift up as the end goal, that you can't take away my freedoms. I need to have the freedom to do this, to do that, to buy guns. Freedom is the tool for serving others. If the freedom that you're clinging on to is preventing you from serving others, is preventing the flourishing of other people, then that's not what Christ gave us freedom for. And it's easy to kind of have a bash at Republicans in America, but there's lots of libertarian thought in the UK on different issues that maybe that would speak into as well. That freedom is a tool for service, not just an end in itself.
And perhaps sometimes that freedom means is letting go of stuff, and perhaps again it's that inconveniencing ourselves for the good of others. That whole sense of comfortable as well.
Yeah, definitely. Can move on briefly to the 2 Kings passage. I haven't thought about this one quite as much. I don't think the justice and politics angle leaps out from this one quite as much. But my one reflection. So this is kind of Elijah being taken up into heaven and Elisha being left behind to kind of take up the mantle. And the thing that struck me was how we can sometimes idealize heroes of the faith, or maybe heroes in our politics, to the extent that we don't think we can replicate what they've done. I think Elisha could have easily looked at Elijah and been like, he's this once in a generation prophet, the likes of which we'll never see again. But immediately after Elijah is taken up into heaven, Elisha takes the cloak and hits the water, and the waters part. So as soon as Elijah's gone, the work that he's done continues and can be replicated. I think for me, sometimes looking at the people that I really respect in Christianity and in doing kind of politics and faith really well, I can easily think, oh, I can't do what they do, or they're one of a kind. But I think what the Bible shows us is that whoever it is, what they've done can be replicated. When God bestows His Spirit on us, He gives us that ability, that we can all do great things through His power.
And we all have something to offer. And for me, the whole fact that Elisha could do that at a time of loss, at a time of sadness, was still able to step up, and that sense that God is with us even when we struggle to see or to experience or feel that sometimes it feels, and when you look at the world, where is God? But actually this reminds us that God is there even in loss or turbulence and change. And as they journey, God is there. And even when Elisha thinks all is finished, because he wasn't going to leave, I won't leave you. Oh, actually, you've gone anyway. So this sense that God is still there and upholds him. Yeah,
and we can still make progress on issues, on things at times when we don't necessarily expect it. It's really helpful that it can be easy to be despondent about the state things are in. Maybe we've tried many times to change something and we're not getting anywhere, but even in times of grief and of sorrow, and that's often where God can work the strongest.
And I think with your idea of, when you've seen these amazing people do amazing things, and we could look back and we could say, oh gosh, it's, the past was better, and actually, what we've got at the moment, and the sense that we need the past because we can learn from it, but equally it's that constantly just keep moving forward, keep putting one foot in front of the other, keep doing the stuff, even if it feels a bit hopeless. Don't stop. It's important, but don't dwell on it. And I think we've got that in all of the readings, really, this sense of just keep moving forward and keep trusting that God is with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Stick it out, keep going. That's a good summary of a few of them, maybe.
Excellent. And is there anything else you'd like to offer us on these texts before we conclude this podcast this week?
I think that's a fairly good place to round it off. Yeah.
Thank you. And just remind us again, it's all we can, isn't it? That gives it that we'll be able to find the resources.
Yes, all we can. I'll just get the exact web link up so I can tell people exactly where it is. So allwecan.org.uk/church resources for Refugee Week 2022/ is where you can find those.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom and your reflections with us. And I've really enjoyed our conversation, and we'll be seeking those resources. I'm not actually preaching this Sunday, but I think it's really helpful to have those reflections on those texts, connecting our faith and the work of politics. If you have enjoyed this episode of Politics in the Pulpit, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, and share this episode with your friends. We know that our listeners are a passionate and knowledgeable crowd, and so we would love you to join in the conversation on Twitter, which is @pulpit_politics, or using the hashtag politics in the pulpit, or on the Facebook community, which you can access through the Joint Public Issues Team Facebook page and their website. There were no questions offered to us this week, but there was an observation on last week that the podcast was thought-provoking and that the language of deportation needs to be changed to reflect what the person posting sees as a policy of state-sponsored trafficking. So instead of the word deportation, we should be using the word trafficking. We do appreciate interaction and response, and the encouragement to those who come on to this podcast to share their thinking. As ever, we'd like to hear from you. And so I pose, as most weeks, a question. Where have you seen God in your life or in the life of others around you this week? This idea of the evidence of the Spirit at work in the world. Where have you seen God in your life or the life of others? So we go forward into the week, both in politics and in our faith life, with a blessing. So let us end with these words. May we be anointed with God's Spirit as we bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Amen. And thank you, Cameron, for sharing with us today, and all the best for the rest of the week. Take care. God bless. Bye-bye.